What would you do if you woke up one morning and discovered that your land, your private property, had become a public road overnight? Not because you sold it, not because the city took it through some legal loophole, but because your entitled neighbors simply decided that your land was now theirs to use. That's exactly what happened to me, and it was the beginning of one of the most frustrating battles I've ever had to fight. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was the sound that tipped me off: gravel crunching under tires, the distant hum of engines, the occasional honk of a car horn. At first, I thought maybe it was a delivery driver turning around in my driveway. But when I looked out my window, what I saw made my stomach drop. A steady stream of cars, SUVs, sedans, even a couple of cyclists, zipped across a narrow strip of land that ran along the side of my property. My land. It wasn't some public access road. It wasn't even a driveway left over from a previous owner. But apparently, my lovely HOA neighbors had decided it was a convenient shortcut to shave a few seconds off their daily commute. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, watching in disbelief as car after car cut through like they were on a highway. Some drivers ignored me completely, while others had the audacity to glare, as if I were the one in their way. One guy even honked at me, like I was standing on his property. That was when I realized this wasn't just a one-time thing. This had been happening for a while. They had gotten so comfortable using my land that they didn't even think twice about it. Enough was enough. I followed the trail of tire marks to see exactly where this so-called road led. It wasn't hard to figure out. The path connected directly to one of the HOA's main streets. No doubt, these people had been using it as a shortcut for months, maybe even years. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the tracks, wondering what the previous owners had used this land for. Maybe it was an old driveway or an access road for utilities. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that the people living in my neighborhood had decided it belonged to them. I wasn't about to let that slide. That afternoon, I called a local surveyor to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Maybe, just maybe, there was some weird easement or shared ownership I hadn't been told about when I bought the property. A few days later, after reviewing records and taking measurements, the surveyor, Mr. Calloway, confirmed what I already knew. Every single inch of that land was mine. No shared access, no public right-of-way, nothing. That was all I needed to hear. It was time to take action. I started simple. I bought a bright orange, private property, no trespassing, sign and planted it right where the strip met the HOA street. For good measure, I added another, smaller sign that read, "Violators will be reported to authorities." I figured that would send a clear message. For the first 2 days, things actually seemed to quiet down. No new tire tracks. No random honking. I let myself believe, just for a moment, that the problem was solved. Then, on the third morning, I heard it again, the sound of tires rolling over gravel. I looked outside just in time to see a white SUV speeding across my land like the signs didn't even exist. Confused, I walked over to check. That's when I saw them. Both signs had been ripped out and tossed into the bushes. Someone had made it crystal clear, they weren't going to stop. That's when I realized, this wasn't just ignorance. This was war. I wasn't the kind of person who looked for fights, but I also wasn't about to let people walk all over me. If a couple of signs weren't enough to send the message, I needed to step it up. That afternoon, I drove back to the hardware store and bought heavy-duty wooden stakes, a roll of thick steel chain, and 2 bright red "Do Not Enter" signs. It wasn't the most elegant solution, but I wasn't aiming for curb appeal. I was aiming for a blockade. I spent the better part of the afternoon hammering the stakes into the ground at each end of the strip and threading the chain through them. When I stepped back to admire my work, I spotted a few people from the HOA standing at a distance, watching me. They didn't say anything, but I could feel their irritation radiating across the property line. Good. Let them be mad. This was my land, and I had every right to protect it. For a few days, the barrier did its job. No more tire tracks, no more cars cutting through. I actually started to feel a sense of relief, like I had finally put an end to this nonsense. But, of course, Karen wasn't going to let it go. One morning, just as I was settling onto my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, I heard an angry, high-pitched voice coming from the edge of my property. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. When I walked over, I found Karen standing near the chain, arms crossed, phone clutched in one hand like a weapon. She was decked out in expensive-looking workout gear, oversized sunglasses perched on her head, and an expression of pure, unfiltered entitlement. The kind of look that said she was used to getting exactly what she wanted. The moment she saw me, she let out an exaggerated sigh, like I was personally ruining her day. "Do you live here?" she snapped, as if I were the trespasser. I stared at her for a beat before answering. "Yeah. I do. Can I help you with something?" She gestured wildly at the chain. "What is this? Why is this here? This is a public road, and you're blocking it." I blinked. Did she really just say that? A public road? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "This isn't a public road," I explained evenly. "It's private property. It belongs to me." Karen scoffed, crossing her arms tighter. "That's ridiculous. People have been using this road for years. You can't just block it off because you feel like it." I let out a dry laugh. "I don't feel like it. I own this land. I hired a surveyor. I have the records to prove it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that," she snapped, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the HOA." I shrugged. "Go ahead. The HOA has no authority over my land." I didn't stick around to hear the rest of her conversation. I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over, and I was right. The next morning, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, and the moment I opened it, my blood boiled. They were fining me. According to the letter, I was in violation of community aesthetic guidelines for putting up an unauthorized barrier. They were demanding that I remove the chain immediately or face a $500 per day fine. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. I wasn't even in the HOA. My property wasn't part of their jurisdiction. They had no legal authority over me. But that didn't stop them from trying to intimidate me into submission. Furious, I grabbed the letter and marched straight to the HOA office. The receptionist barely looked up as I stormed in. "I need to speak to someone about this," I said, slapping the letter onto the counter. A few minutes later, a man in a crisp polo shirt and khakis came out. He introduced himself as Mr. Reynolds, the HOA representative. He barely glanced at me before giving a practiced, patronizing smile. "How can I help you?" I tapped the letter. "You can start by explaining why the HOA thinks it can fine me for putting up a barrier on my own land." Reynolds sighed, folding his hands in front of him like a disappointed teacher about to lecture a student. "You may not be a member of the HOA," he admitted, "but your property affects the community. Your barrier is unsightly and disrupts the natural flow of the neighborhood." I nearly laughed. "Oh, so now my land is a community issue?" It wasn't a problem when people were illegally driving through it. He gave another tight smile. "We're simply enforcing the neighborhood's rules." I leveled him with a stare. "You have no authority over my land. If you try to fine me again, I'll take legal action." His smile didn't falter, but I could see a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I'll make a note of your concerns," he said, "but I suggest you reconsider." I didn't bother responding. I turned and walked out, my mind already made up. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. The battle should have ended there. I had made my stance clear, my lawyer was on standby, and the HOA had no legal right to fine me. But I underestimated just how far Karen and her crew were willing to go. Because they weren't just going to argue. They weren't just going to whine. They were going to steal. It started when I received an email alert from a real estate listing site. It was a generic notification, the kind I usually ignored, but something caught my eye, a property listing in my neighborhood. The title? Upcoming HOA Green Space, Future Development Project. I clicked on the link, and my stomach dropped. There it was, my land. Aerial shots, a description of the space, even an estimated price tag for future investors. The listing claimed the land was part of an HOA expansion project and that it would soon be developed into a community park and walking path. They were advertising my private property as if it already belonged to them. Worse, it was marked, pending sale. I saw red. It took everything in me to stay calm as I grabbed my phone and dialed the real estate agency. A chipper-sounding woman answered. "Hello, thanks for calling Fairway Realty. How can I assist you today?" I forced my voice to stay even. "Yeah, I need some clarification on a listing. The one for the upcoming HOA Green Space. Can you tell me who listed that property?" There was a pause. "Let me check for you." I could hear her typing in the background before she finally responded. That listing was submitted by the Evergreen Heights HOA board. "Are you interested in placing an offer?" I nearly dropped the phone. "Interested? It's my land." Silence. Then a nervous chuckle. "I'm sorry, sir, but according to the listing notes, the HOA has confirmed." I cut her off. "Listen carefully. The HOA doesn't own that land. I do. I have the deed, the surveyor reports, everything. You need to take that listing down now before you get hit with a lawsuit." That got her attention. "Sir, if there's been a mistake, I'll need to check with my supervisor." "You do that," I snapped. "And while you're at it, I want the name of whoever authorized this listing." A few hours later, I got a call back. The agent sounded a lot less confident this time. "Sir, we've removed the listing and flagged it for fraudulent misrepresentation. The submission came directly from the HOA president, a Mrs. Karen Whitman." Of course. I didn't waste another second. I called my lawyer and filed an official fraud complaint against the HOA. They had attempted to sell property that didn't belong to them, and that crossed a line even their stupid fines and intimidation tactics hadn't. But Karen wasn't done. That night, I woke up to loud metallic clanking outside. My first thought was that someone was trying to break into my shed. But when I looked outside, I saw them. A group of men, all wearing reflective vests, were removing my chain barrier. A flatbed truck was parked at the edge of my property, and 2 workers were pulling out paving materials. They were paving over my land. I was outside in seconds, heart pounding, fury building with every step. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, storming toward them. One of the workers, a stocky man with a clipboard, barely looked up. "Evening, sir. We're working on a scheduled road maintenance project." "This isn't a road. This is my land." He frowned, finally glancing at me. "We have approval from the HOA to install an access road here. Work order says it's community property." I had never wanted to strangle someone more in my life. "The HOA doesn't own this land. They lied to you. Stop working, right now, or I'm calling the cops." He hesitated, looking at the other workers. "I can't do that, sir. I have my orders." I pulled out my phone. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm calling 911. You can either shut this down now, or you can explain to the police why you're trespassing on private property." That got him moving. He turned and barked at the crew to stop. The workers looked confused, but they started loading their equipment back onto the truck. By the time Officer Mitchell arrived, the crew was halfway through packing up. He took one look at my property, one look at the abandoned paving materials, and let out a sigh. "Let me guess. HOA Karen," I confirmed. He rubbed his temples. "I swear, if I get one more call about her." He turned to the foreman. "You got permits for this work?" The guy shook his head. "We were told it was pre-approved by the HOA. They said it was a community road." Mitchell nodded grimly. "Then you're lucky this guy stopped you before you did any real damage. Pack it up, boys." As the crew left, Mitchell turned back to me. "You need to file a restraining order. I don't know what Karen's deal is, but she's escalating fast. If she tries this again, we'll push for criminal charges." I exhaled sharply. I was hoping it wouldn't come to that. Mitchell gave me a look. "Hope's got nothing to do with it. You're dealing with a woman who thinks she owns the world." He wasn't wrong. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. I wanted to believe the worst was over. The fraudulent land listing had been taken down, the illegal construction had been stopped, and Karen had been caught red-handed in her latest scheme. But people like Karen don't just give up. They don't accept consequences. They don't learn their lessons. They double down, and that's exactly what she did. A few days later, I stepped outside to grab my mail and froze. A bright orange eviction notice was taped to my front door. My pulse spiked as I ripped it off and read the fine print. The notice, issued by the county, claimed that my home had been declared abandoned and was scheduled for repossession. I saw red. Storming inside, I called the county office and demanded to speak to someone. After being transferred 3 times, I finally got an official on the line. "Sir, your property was reported as abandoned and in violation of local maintenance codes," the man said, his tone flat and bureaucratic. The HOA filed the complaint. They provided evidence that the home has been vacant for months. I nearly crushed the phone in my hand. "I live here," I growled. "I've lived here this whole time. Who the hell authorized this complaint?" I heard the sound of typing on the other end before the man hesitated. It was submitted by a Mrs. Karen Whitman, acting on behalf of the Evergreen Heights HOA. Of course. I sucked in a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Listen to me. This is my property. I have proof that I live here. That complaint is fraudulent, and if you don't revoke it immediately, I will be filing a lawsuit against both the HOA and your office for wrongful eviction." That got his attention. There was a long pause before he finally cleared his throat. "Sir, if you can provide proof of residency, we can close the case." I didn't waste time. Within an hour, I was at the county office with a stack of documents, utility bills, mortgage statements, tax records, even security footage of me walking in and out of my house over the past week. The moment the official saw the evidence, he paled. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize. This should never have been processed. The eviction order will be rescinded immediately." That wasn't good enough. "And Karen? What happens to her?" "She filed a false report. There has to be consequences." The man sighed. "We'll be launching an investigation into the HOA's actions." That wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was a start. I walked out of that office knowing one thing: Karen had just crossed a line she couldn't come back from. I called my lawyer that afternoon. We weren't just going after the HOA anymore. We were going after Karen personally. And I wasn't the only one fed up with her. The next day, I got an unexpected visitor. A young man in his late 20s knocked on my door, looking nervous but determined. He introduced himself as Ryan Carter, a newer member of the HOA board. "Look," he said, shifting awkwardly, "I wasn't involved in any of this, but I know what's been going on. The board held an emergency meeting last night. We've decided to cut ties with Karen. I raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Ryan exhaled. Meaning she's been removed from the board. Effective immediately. I was speechless for a moment. Karen had been fired? A lot of us didn't agree with how she was handling things, Ryan admitted. But we didn't realize how bad it had gotten until the fraud complaint and the eviction mess. She acted completely on her own. The HOA doesn't want to be dragged down with her. I stared at him, trying to gauge whether he was sincere. So what happens now? The HOA is officially dropping all claims against your land. We'll be sending you a formal statement confirming that we will no longer interfere with your property. I wanted to feel relieved. I wanted to believe that this nightmare was finally over. But deep down, I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to let things go. And I had a terrible feeling that she still had one last move left to play. For the first time in weeks, my land was quiet. No more cars cutting through. No more HOA letters. No more entitled demands. Karen had been removed from the board, the HOA had officially backed off, and legally, I had won. But something still didn't sit right with me. People like Karen don't go down quietly. And I was right. Because just as I was starting to believe that peace had returned, she made her final, desperate move. It was late one evening when I noticed it, a flickering glow at the edge of my property. At first, I thought maybe someone had left their headlights on, but as I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. Flames. Small, but unmistakable. Fire was spreading across the dry grass near where my chain barrier had once stood. Someone had set fire to my land. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the closest bucket, filled it with water, and sprinted toward the flames. My heart pounded as I doused them before they could spread. By the time the fire department arrived, the damage was minimal, but the message was clear: this wasn't an accident. The police took my statement, and I made sure to mention the ongoing feud with the HOA. Officer Mitchell, looking more exhausted than ever, rubbed his temples. We don't have solid evidence yet, but I'm gonna be real with you, we both know who's behind this. That was all I needed to hear. My lawyer wasted no time filing a restraining order against Karen and pushing for an official criminal investigation. The moment that paperwork went through, Karen disappeared. Gone from the HOA. Gone from the neighborhood. It was as if she had never existed. Whether she left on her own or was quietly forced out, I didn't care. She was gone. And I had my home back. Months passed, and the strip of land that had once caused so much chaos became exactly what it was meant to be, mine. No more trespassers. No more late-night fights. Just peace. But if there was one thing I learned from all of this, it was that standing your ground isn't always easy. People will push, they will test you, and some, like Karen, will do anything to take what isn't theirs. But when you fight back, when you refuse to roll over, that's when you win. And if Karen ever decides to make a comeback, well, let's just say, I'll be ready. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.